Those who knew her say Makia Coney had an infectious smile and a huge heart. This is the area where the body was located on Wednesday night.
I cannot emphasize enough, anyone who would commit such a crime across from a police substation with a couple hundred police cars, I'm very, very concerned.
Everybody knows kids will be kids.
Parents at University Christian School can't imagine who could be responsible for the brutal murder of 17-year-old Makia Coney. Detectives spent much of the day here talking with students and teachers. You can see their crime scene van, and they looked at every truck in the parking lot.
You good? All right. All right. Now, as far as Makia, you said you had a thing together.
Yeah, I should.
Do you know anybody who would be mad enough to do something as bad as this to her?
No, sir.
Does it bother you what happened?
Yes, sir.
Here we are in a murder investigation of someone who Charles Southern had an on and off again relationship with, and he has virtually no emotional reaction to it. It certainly would raise questions of how could somebody be so calm?
About what time was it that you saw Connor?
Probably around 3:30, over there in the weight room, and he had to work out. So I just hung out with him for a little bit.
Okay. Have you heard anything about what may have happened to me?
I heard Connor walked her to Taco Bell.
Okay, but if he was with you in the weight room, how would he be able to do that without you knowing?
I don't know.
Southern's giving a timeline and a story that doesn't make a lot of sense. He's essentially throwing his friend Connor under the bus, but he doesn't spend much time thinking about is how those two realities can't coexist.
Even though police are suspicious because of his contradictory statements that are being made, it's not enough for them to make an arrest. It's just enough for them to keep watching him and try to find out if there's any validity behind what he's saying.
Okay. Of course, you know what we're here about. It's about Makia's death.
Yes, sir.
Now, what time did you say you saw her?
The only time I've talked to her was like passing in the hallway or something like that, but we're not really close. We don't talk much.
Okay. I'll show you something.
Big trouble.
Very easy to see on film.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? When it comes down to it, Connor, if we can't believe what you tell us, you're in a world of hurt.
He's distancing himself from the crime. He's distancing himself from the victim. Detectives are using their own experience and common sense to realize that either one or both of these suspects, Southern, Pridgeon, maybe both, are somehow either involved in the crime or they know more than they're letting on. And so now they're challenging him, and Pridgeon's got some decisions to make about how far he goes with these lies.
What do you want to tell me, Connor?
I witnessed something.
What did you witness?
Charles accidentally shoot Makia.
Do you know what was going to happen?
So I didn't know. We got out of the car, and he ended up coming out with like a 6-shot revolver. I was like waving around in the air. Didn't mean to do anything with it. It was just like playful looking. Like he didn't have his finger on the trigger when he pointed it. And then he was pointing around with Makia. The gun went off and he said it was an accident.
How long has she been on the ground before he fired that second shot?
Almost immediately.
If it's an accident, man, it's an accident, okay? You're not gonna stand over her and put one in her head. You're not gonna assassinate the girl for an accident.
She was executed. And you know that, you watched it.
Got probably 4 hours of sleep yesterday.
Teenagers sometimes lie. Their impulse control is poor. But what we also see in psychopathic individuals is this pattern of pathological lying. There's a compulsive need to lie, filling in the blanks. It's clear that Makia was shot twice. She was shot at close range by highly destructive bullets. The only thing Pridgeon comes up with is, I only got about 4 hours of sleep. Most of us, if we were in this situation and witnessed something that horrific, might not have slept at all.
I want you to listen to a phone call that just came in.
Joe? Sure. What happened? A friend that was with me, Connor Pridgeon. He shot my kid. Connor did? Yes, sir. And you were there? Yes, sir.
Yeah. This is bullshit. He's supposed to be a good friend of mine, and then he's gonna say and put it all on me, like I did it, I shot her.
Do you think face-to-face that you could get him to tell the truth?
I'll talk to him face-to-face, but I think he's just gonna deny it.
The two of them are so rapidly and desperately and impulsively trying to explain away their guilt that they don't really think about the consequences of what they're saying, that they're going to now have to address the fact that they were each there.
Did he tell you why I did it?
How's that?
You know, if you're out there and someone kills your girlfriend right in front of you, and I mean, you're not even fazed. That's something I've got to understand. Connor has never had any relationship with her, correct? Well, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
All right, here's where my dilemma is. You still don't have any emotion, okay? This doesn't bother you.
Usually people have a reason to kill somebody. People just don't go around
Killing.
just killing somebody just to be killing.
Unless they're a sociopath. Sociopath doesn't have those feelings of guilt or remorse. They can talk to you time after time after time and lie to you about something even as brutal as a murder.
So that's what you think I am?
The thing that he was most upset about wasn't that they were accusing him of murder, wasn't the fact that he would be going to prison for the rest of his life. It's that the detective probably accurately referred to him as a sociopath. A lot of people will use psychopath and sociopath interchangeably. Impugning his honor is almost the thing that got him most upset.
Charles, Connor, come in. I want you to tell him what you're telling us.
You shot her. I went for the gun. That's it. And you told me when we got back in the truck, if I tell anybody, you were gonna shoot me next.
How would I shoot you if I didn't have a gun? You had the gun, you shot her first, point blank range to the temple.
So the story changes again when the two defendants are in the room together. And you almost get the sense that they're trying to watch each other and see what they should be saying and take cues from one another, but they really fail at that. They can't quite figure out what to say after the one just spoke. And in the end, you know, they're still trying to point fingers at the other one, but there are some slippages. For instance, whenever he stated that he didn't shoot her first. So acknowledging, in fact, that somebody shot her obviously a second time.
You know, they say in the law is you should be able to face your accuser.
Yeah, I didn't shoot her.
That you didn't shoot her, it wasn't an accident.
None of the above.
But you put in the kill shot.
No, I put in the kill shot. If
The
she
second shot
to
killed her.
that.
The second shot killed her. First shot she could have survived. When it comes to the trophy, Connor, you got it on this one.
I wasn't looking for a trophy.
If that's what you were looking for, partner, if you were looking for recognition, status, that you're a cold killer and that you're, you know, a macho guy, you won because you're a cold killer. Charles, look at me. Tell me. I know you want to.
I had the gun pulled back, the hammer,
Mm-hmm.
and I was wanting to scare her, you know, just to mess around. And I didn't know how easy it pulled back.
Was it an accident?
Yes, sir.
He didn't shoot her on accident. He had the gun pointed straight at her head.
Well, why'd you shoot her?
Because I just wanted to get out of there. I didn't know whether she was alive or dead, but I figured she was probably dead, so I just popped the second round.
Mm-hmm.
Not even thinking about it.
So the fact that Southern is waving around a loaded firearm, per his account here, and pointing it at a victim, a girl that he dated on and off, just shows how he has no value in human life, and it's rather cold and callous. It's also very telling because Pridgeon then, immediately after she's shot, decides to just shoot her again. Most individuals would check to see if the person would still be alive, especially if they thought it was an accidental shooting. Most individuals wouldn't just shoot the person again. And the way he described it was with zero remorse.
Why Makia?
He had gotten in a fight with her at school. He was already messing around with other girls, but he got mad when she started messing around with other guys.
If these statements are accurate and that was really Southern's impetus for choosing her, it makes it clear that he was really objectifying her, that she was really an object for him, a pawn, you know, for him to use and do what he wanted to when he wanted to. But he expected to be free to date whoever he wanted to.
People with psychopathic traits tend to be more possessive and jealous than others. One, because they have this insatiable need for power and control. The motive for Southern is starting to shape up here, where we understand this is about jealousy and power and control over Makia. He has apparently lost this, and that makes him angry. But why Pridgeon would cooperate and go along with this, that's still unclear.
He said, like, that he had wanted to shoot her.
And because of that argument, he wanted to kill her.
He had said, like, he'd always wanted to try it. He said that he wanted to know what it felt like before he went in the Marine Corps.
And how about you?
I mean, I always had it, like, I've always played, like, video games and stuff like that, whereas anything like that, it wasn't really, like, an emotional thing in video game or whatever. But I had never done it in real life. I was curious about it.
Both of them had expressed this desire to kill someone to see what it was like. It's possible, given their shared interest in killing someone, that there was really a synergy between the two of them, and they just fed off of one another.
Everything was like happy. She had no way of knowing. Just like joking around pretty much.
Okay.
He pretty much tried to make it look as like non-suspicious as possible. But the whole time
He's telling detectives how they lured Makia out to this vacant area so they could kill her. So this shows it was very premeditated. They were trying to gain her trust and use their charm to lure her out there. Superficial charm is employed so psychopaths can get their way. using honey versus force. And so if they can get somebody to do what they want and get them to come to them and do it with the least amount of resistance, it just makes it easier.
Tell me exactly what really happened, what transpired.
She was facing the creek and talking to Charles, and Charles was standing like almost directly behind her, and he had looked at me and then pulled out a gun that he had in his waistband. She was talking, smoking. As soon as she got to where she turned her head like that, he already had the gun fully extended. Shot her.
Did she never see it?
Never saw it coming. She dropped to the ground. Charles is talking to me.
What did he say?
He asked if I was gonna shoot her, because I guess he thought with me being interested in like the morbid curiosity type thing, that I'd want to shoot her or whatever. And we had argued about that for about 5 minutes. Just like, why won't you do it, blah, blah, blah. I finally I pulled the gun straight out of my waistband and shot her from like 6 feet away. I didn't plan on shooting anybody when I went out there. I planned on just watching it go down.
You remember when we've talked every other time, you said it was almost instantaneous.
I had already had the gun in my waistband, which I lied about.
Why are you lying?
It's part of me, like, natural instinct.
He's trying to still downplay his culpability while letting his true colors show through. He's admitting that he's just a natural liar. It's what he does over and over.
The idea that Charles had gotten mad at her because she was seeing someone else.
No, it wasn't a motive behind it. It could have been anybody else, to be honest with you. It didn't have to be her, but that was like
she was just
opportunity.
About a week before all this happened, I told Connor one day when we were smoking cigars that I ain't got much money now, and he told me about robbing people. He said, there'd be some things that you gotta do, like shooting people or stuff like that, holding up people. And he asked if I was about that, if I would do it.
Criminal versatility, which means committing multiple different types of crime, and having a juvenile delinquency, which means committing crimes as a young person under the age of 18, both are red flags when it comes to psychopathy.
Southern was asked to leave Missouri after he got in trouble with the law. He relocated to Florida with extended relatives. Once he came to Florida, he ended up in a good crowd. He was on the football team. He was doing well at this private school. He had good family support. But one of the things that we oftentimes find with psychopathic individuals is that they crave a high. They crave stimulation. They get bored very easily. What Southern missed was that thrill-seeking sensation that oftentimes psychopathic individuals get. And so it was only a matter of time before he was going to return to his criminal activity. But he had already done robbing. He needed something more. And killing was the next thing on the list.
And who suggested, of the two of you, that Makia be the target?
It was me, man.
Were you angry at her, or did you see her as an easy target? Someone to shoot?
Yeah, someone to shoot. I wasn't mad at her or anything.
Why? Just to see what it was like?
I felt like, he challenged me. I had to prove myself.
You had to man up?
Yeah. Basically called me chicken. Told him I'd take the first shot. So I walked over there and still smoking, Then I walked closer to her, pulled out my gun and shot her. She was stumbling. And I looked over the passenger side, and I seen Connor pull out his gun and shoot her the second time. He said, I didn't think you.
Prosecutors say Kimberly Lynn Cates, 42, a nurse and mother, died of wounds to her head, torso, arms, and legs. Daughter Jamie, an 11-year-old sixth grader, remains in intensive care. Her throat cut, a leg broken. There are reports she managed to call 911 after the attack for help.
We just kept saying to ourselves, why that, seemingly unassuming home?
It was like we could go in and torture him, and then we got to the house.
Okay. And if there wasn't anybody home,
it would have just been a robbery. It was almost like an excuse to kill somebody. It was more like a bonus.
New Hampshire state troopers have just arrested 4 individuals suspected for the brutal murder of Kimberly Cates. Her daughter Jamie remains in critical condition. Police were allegedly tipped off from multiple witnesses reporting that 4 teenagers were heard bragging about the murder to friends. The suspects were identified as Stephen Spader, Christopher Gribble, Quinn Glover, and William Marks. All 4 suspects are now in custody of the New Hampshire State Police with charges pending.
I just want to be able to record this, and you told me before I turned it on that that was no problem.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
What do you know about what happened up there in Mount Vernon?
All I know is, when there was something about, there was a lady killed in Mount Vernon, and there's, a young girl that's in stable condition in the hospital. Which, honestly, I hope she's going to be okay, because that's horrible to do something to a little girl. But assuming that somebody specifically tried to kill them, that rubs against my conscience personally. I'm one of those type of gentlemanly chivalry sort of guys that you don't even hit girls, let alone go out and treat them badly.
Gribble's reaction to investigators when he's questioned about this brutal crime is inconsistent with how a lot of typical teenage boys and teenagers would react. He's very calm, he's very even in his tone. But what he also is doing is he's impression managing. He's trying to push a narrative on the investigators about how he couldn't possibly be someone that would do this, and that he's this upstanding member of society.
Well, Chris, it's funny you should mention that, because I want to let you know she is going to survive, fortunately.
That's good.
Why is it you think you're here, sitting with us? What has brought you here to this point?
I don't know. I can't tell you anything but what I think I did.
What you think you did? Don't tell me what you think you did. Tell me what you did. Okay? Be a man and tell me what you did.
We don't do anything on Saturday nights. We just drive around. I didn't do anything. I find it very hard to believe if I didn't do anything, you could really prove that I did something. Since I didn't do it, I'm sorry, this was wasting time.
Individuals, when they want to control the interview or they want to manipulate the person that's interviewing them, they'll dance around the question. It is hypocritical because just a few minutes ago, he said, I'm chivalrous, implying I would be helpful if I could. But here we see him later in the interview basically not giving up any information, being incredibly vague, insincere, and just all around not helpful.
He's almost challenging them. Prove that you have anything on me, otherwise, I'm walking out of here.
Don't know anything about machete.
I never put a machete in my trunk.
I didn't ask you if you put it in your trunk. I'm asking if you can tell me anything about a machete.
I've seen a machete.
Yeah? Where'd you see it? Don't know anyone who owns one.
My dad used to, but it got lost in the move. When we moved from Utah to here.
You remember Dad having a machete out in Utah, but you still remember that. You can't remember what you did Saturday night.
I thought that was pretty awesome.
I think we all need a break. Is that all right?
Sure.
All right.
What the detective's starting to do is confront him, and some of that is to see if Gribble cracks. He doesn't show any real stress response. He starts to laugh almost sarcastically. This is also where we start to see more and more of those psychopathic traits really emerge. He's not expressing any stress about what they know at all.
Why don't you go ahead and tell us what you know about the incident out in Mount Vernon? Who were you there with? Steve Spader and Chris. I get a call or a text from Stevie saying that we're gonna go drive next to mine. Did they drive you by the house? Yeah. We were pretty much approaching the house slowly, you know. They wanted to go around in the back, so we did.
What we see is what we would expect to see with most teenagers. He's scared, there's not a lot of energy, and he's somewhat defeated. But what he is also is cooperative. The minute you have a crime partner who's willing to talk, you've got leverage. And most significantly and obviously, what they now have is a witness.
All the lights are still off at this point, so we're just standing around in the dark, and I guess I hear talking. And then so I scream, and then I heard a bunch of splashing on the bed, and someone saying, "Don't do this, stop." Again, I'm going to ask you, have you heard any more details after the fact? Any of the guys talking about it? They seemed quite amused by it. Who's they? Steve and Chris. They just laughing about it. They seemed to not really care. Afterwards, they said that, you know, I guess it was, they said pretty much it was like, it was fun.
You almost hear in Marks's account of this that he's still in disbelief, that his friends really didn't have the same plan in mind. It wasn't about robbing these two people. They wanted to kill. It was maybe indulging in and giving in on a fantasy and an urge that they had both had for some time.
Okay, with that said, we're going to take a break, okay?
You are interested in discussing the matter of this homicide again?
Yes, I am. For the main reason that it was a conspiracy. Steve and I are very similar. Steve and Spader. Both of us grew up with problems in our families. Technically, we're both sociopaths. I do not use that as an excuse. I just thought I'd let you know.
He is saying, I'm not using being a sociopath as an excuse, but he does disclose that he had the bad childhood, which I feel is an excuse or some mitigation. I think that he's also just grandiose, and he wants to show them how smart he is. Look, I have insight into myself. Here's who I am.
What we know about Gribble is in 2007, he had been in trouble for sexually harassing and inappropriately touching someone. And in the process, his family took him to see a therapist. One of the things that emerged was that he was off the scales, high and elevated in the domain that we think of as sociopathy or psychopathy. Oftentimes in media, we hear interchangeably the term psychopath, the term sociopath. And it's important to realize that for us as forensic experts, we talk about it as psychopathy, but they are the same terms.
Steve and I have been friends for a very long time. Well, in the past 3 weeks, we've been kind of desperate for cash, and we ended up robbing the house next to him. However, about a few days ago, we decided that we were still low on cash. We couldn't manage to get jobs, and we were going to try and get another robbery. Saturday morning, when I was with Steve, he told me that him and Billy had been cruising around and had found a house out in Mount Vernon. I had found a machete that my father owned, and Steve had mentioned he liked machetes, so I brought it along.
Did you think that if somebody was there, if they resisted, you were going to kill them, or it was just...
We were just going to kill them. I think Steve enjoys just the butchery part of it, just the power.
Yeah.
I'm more of a precision sort of guy. If I went in there to kill, I'm just going to kill him. I'm not going to make a big deal about it. There's no point to make it worse. It's not in my repertoire. Steve had mentioned that we weren't going to have time to torture and that we'd do it some other time. So I'm guessing he was into it.
Gribble is almost minimizing his culpability. He's saying, I'm not like that. I'm a better guy. I just kill and I just get it over with. And it almost sounds like he's trying to juxtapose himself with a way worse person, belittling the fact that this was a gruesome, horrific murder.
And if there wasn't anybody home,
it would have just been a robbery.
But
it was almost like an excuse to kill somebody.
Kind of.
It was more like a bonus. I don't know, I guess me and Steve are pretty messed up people. I'll be perfectly honest, I wanted to kill someone for a long time. It's like an urge, and it was kind of a time that I could get it out. We looked around for a good entry point when we finally found one basement window we thought we could open. And we went in and started looking around. We started to get a little bit relaxed and started talking. That's when they woke up. The mother said something like, "Jamie, is that you?" Steve started hacking at the bed with a machete. But I heard him hit the mom, and so I dove in and stabbed her a few times in the chest. I was controlled, but I didn't really feel much of anything.
What were Quinn and Billy doing?
They stayed by the door. They didn't do anything. All honesty, we did everything. The girl jumped up and jumped over her mother as Steve was hacking away, and she jumped right into my arms. I stabbed her somewhere on the front right chest area. I tried to twist her around so I could get a better shot at her heart. It was automatic.
He's reliving it, almost like somebody would be feeling joy when they're retelling about a family vacation. He clearly enjoyed this, despite the butchery and just how sadistic and inhumane this was, and yet he's enjoying it. And it's clear as he's telling investigators, I imagine if we could watch him as he's telling it, he'd be smiling.
He turned around, he looked like Jason from Halloween. The mom was obviously not gonna make it, but she was still breathing.
Yeah.
So I went over and stabbed her in the side of the neck to make sure her artery bled out. Put the machete on top of another trash bag, along with the knife, and booked it off.
The fact that Gribble's first thought is to go back to the fantasy of a horror movie really speaks to the fact that these guys do not live in reality. They have really fused what is play acting and made for TV and movies and violence that is contrived for entertainment purposes to that being their script. Their way of navigating the world is this script that they have crafted.
Steve and I went over to Autumn's. It was probably about 5 o'clock to 5:30 when we got back to Autumn's.
Mm-hmm.
Autumn was ready to give us the alibi, and so he crashed at his place.
Mm-hmm.
We got on the online telegraph and looked at it and found out the girl had survived. And they were like, "Wow, Chris, you couldn't even kill a 10-year-old. Gave me a really hard time. I kind of wish she died for her sake. Just because she's going to have to live with all that now.
And there's a lot to live with.
If I'm going to kill someone, I'm going to actually do it so that they don't have to sit and live with a bunch of trauma. I've been through so much trauma, I don't want someone to go through that."
These teenagers can't wait to get home and see whether there's any buzz. They follow the news closely. They start talking to their friends about what they did. And that's where we really start to see the ego and the self-focus that this was a thrill kill. What is important in this explanation he gives the detective is while on the surface it sounds like there's a little empathy for this child victim, he then very skillfully and sadly turns this all back to himself. And that's where we see the narcissism. It's now about his own traumatic experiences, his life as he sees it.
I remember being kind of like, this isn't a normal high, and I was just kind of neutral the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
It was awesome because it was like, my system was all in shock.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of like, my nerves were running rampant. I had a bunch of adrenaline in my system.
Individuals with psychopathic traits do seek stimulation, and they also may get an adrenaline rush from hurting other people, or, they get a thrill and a rush out of seeking opportunities that benefit them. Had Gribble not gotten caught, there are so many red flags that this would be a repeat offense, that he could engage in this type of behavior again.
But I'll be honest with you, I can't say I was sorry about it. I just felt nothing. It was kind of cool because it was different, but I'm not really sure if I have the conscience anymore.
I knew he was talking about doing a job that night.
What do you mean by a job?
A mission, quote unquote, because he wanted to make his own bike club, and he said this was going to be the initiation mission.
You know the name of the bike club he was starting?
Disciples of Destruction.
Do you know who else was part of Disciples of Destruction?
Quinn and Billy and Steve. Steve was the catalyst to finding things in common. I mean, there really wasn't much to say about Chris up until a few days before the whole Kate's incident.
Marks and Glover were attracted to Spader. They weren't bothered by the idea of doing a home invasion. They weren't concerned about their future, and they had a more antisocial outlook in life. Where Gribble fits into this is that Gribble and Spader went back to childhood. Their families went to church together, but somehow that disturbed thinking of homicidal urges was the nexus that may have bonded Spader with Gribble.
Christopher Gribble and Steven Spader seem to be like-minded in some ways, very interested in looking out for number one, very interested in achieving whatever they want to achieve, however they need to do it, robbing or hurting people if they need to. So it may be, in a sense that individuals with similar psychopathic traits sort of gravitate toward one another.
Once we escalate to trial and we move forward, Gribble makes claims that he's insane. What we see is this complete failure to take responsibility and a lack of willingness to take responsibility for his crime.
I wanted to get out and have a real social life. I wanted to torture my mom to death. I'd get to the point at night where I just really wanted to sneak in my dad's bedroom, pull the gun out, and shoot myself in the head, because I just wanted it to end.
There are places in the world where silence feels different. Not peaceful silence. Not the kind that settles over a town at the end of a long day. A heavier silence. The kind that seems to remember things. The kind that lingers long after everyone else has gone home. On the eastern coast of New Zealand's North Island, where rugged farmland stretches toward the sea and narrow roads cut through isolated patches of countryside, lies a small community called Mohaka. To outsiders, Mohaka appears almost untouched by time. A place where people know each other's names. Where family histories stretch back generations. Where visitors can drive for miles without passing another vehicle. Where the night arrives quickly, swallowing entire landscapes beneath darkness. It is the sort of place many people imagine when they think of escape. The sort of place where violent crime seems impossible. But on the evening of June 18, 2019, that illusion shattered. Somewhere in the darkness outside a rural property, a young man waited. He was not there by accident. He had not taken a wrong turn. He had not simply wandered into the night. According to evidence later presented in court, he arrived armed. He arrived with purpose. And he arrived willing to use violence. The people inside the house had no idea what was waiting beyond the darkness. No flashing warning signs. No desperate phone calls. No indication that within minutes, a life would be permanently erased. Then came a brief encounter. A moment so short it could almost be measured in heartbeats. A few words. A confrontation. A weapon raised. And a blast that tore through the night. When the sound faded, 29-year-old Michael Huatar had suffered catastrophic injuries. The peaceful isolation of Mojaca instantly transformed into the center of a homicide investigation. Police would descend upon the community. Roads would be scrutinized. Witnesses interviewed. Rumors would spread through households, workplaces, and family gatherings. People who had known one another for years suddenly found themselves asking difficult questions. Who had done this? Why? And perhaps most disturbing of all, had the killing been planned? Because as investigators began pulling apart the events leading up to the shooting, a troubling picture started to emerge. This was not a random act. This was not an argument that unexpectedly spiraled out of control. Days before the fatal shooting, tensions had already been building. There had been accusations, conflict, violence, a growing sense that something dangerous was unfolding beneath the surface of everyday life. Yet few could have imagined where those tensions would lead. The investigation would reveal a sequence of choices. One decision after another. Each step carrying the situation closer toward a point of no return. A firearm obtained. A destination chosen. A journey made under cover of darkness. A wait. A confrontation. A trigger pulled. And afterward, an attempt to disappear into the landscape itself. The man responsible would leave the scene. He would abandon a vehicle. Travel across farmland. Move through the darkness. And dispose of the weapon. For a short time, the truth remained hidden among the rolling countryside of Hawke's Bay. But not for long. Because murder leaves traces. Sometimes those traces are physical. A footprint. A tire mark. A discarded object. Other times they exist inside human memory. A face seen at the wrong place. A conversation remembered later. A detail that seems insignificant until investigators begin assembling the pieces. And piece by piece, detectives would reconstruct what happened that night. The closer they got to the truth, the more disturbing the picture became. This was a case that would expose how quickly personal conflict can evolve into irreversible violence. How a single decision made in anger can destroy multiple lives at once. And how the consequences of one moment can echo through families and communities for years. For Michael Huatar's loved ones, June 18th was not merely a date on a calendar. It became a dividing line. A moment separating life into two distinct chapters. Everything before. And everything after. Before that evening, there had been plans, conversations, routines, and expectations for the future. Afterward, there was grief. Questions. Courtrooms. And the unbearable reality that someone they loved would never return home. As the investigation unfolded, another reality became increasingly clear. The victim and the eventual killer were not strangers. They existed within the same social world. Their paths had crossed before. This was not a faceless predator emerging from nowhere. This was someone known. Someone recognizable. Someone whose actions would leave an entire community struggling to understand how things had reached such a devastating point. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire case was not the shooting itself. It was what happened beforehand. Because according to court findings, the gunman did not simply stumble into a confrontation. He waited. He remained concealed. He watched. He anticipated someone emerging from the property. Those details would later become central to understanding the seriousness of the crime. They transformed the shooting from a tragic encounter into something far more deliberate. Far more calculated. And far more difficult to explain away. In true crime stories, there is often a temptation to search for a single moment where everything went wrong. One argument. One insult. One reckless choice. But reality is rarely that simple. Real violence often grows slowly. Invisible at first. A tension here. A grudge there. A confrontation that seems minor. A threat that is dismissed. Until eventually all those fragments collide. And when they do, the consequences can be devastating. The Mohacker murder was not merely the story of one fatal gunshot. It was the story of a chain reaction. A series of events moving steadily toward catastrophe. A story that began before anyone realized danger was approaching. A story that ended with a young man dead, another facing life imprisonment, and an entire community forced to confront the aftermath. Tonight, we follow that chain. We return to the isolated roads of Mohacker. We examine the tensions that existed beneath the surface. We trace the investigation that uncovered the truth. And we explore the courtroom battle that ultimately delivered justice for Michael Huatar. Because behind every headline lies a deeper story. A story of choices, consequences, loss, and the fragile line separating conflict from tragedy. This is the story of the Mohacker murder. To understand what happened on the night Michael Huatar was killed, it is necessary to understand the place where it happened. Not simply the coordinates on a map. Not merely the name of a small settlement tucked along the eastern coastline of New Zealand's North Island. But the atmosphere. The rhythm of daily life. The invisible connections that tie people together in communities where everyone seems to know everyone else. Because crimes do not happen in a vacuum. Every act of violence unfolds within a setting, and sometimes that setting becomes a character in the story itself. Mohacker is one of those places. The settlement sits in a landscape that feels vast and ancient. Rolling farmland stretches across the countryside. Paddocks disappear toward distant hills. Rivers carve paths through the terrain before eventually finding the sea. On some mornings, mist hangs low over the fields, softening the outlines of fences and trees. On others, the sky opens into a brilliant blue expanse that seems to go on forever. Visitors driving through the region often describe a sense of isolation. Not isolation in a negative sense. Rather, a feeling that the modern world has somehow loosened its grip here. There are no crowded city streets. No endless streams of traffic. No towering buildings casting shadows across busy sidewalks. Instead, there are winding roads, grazing livestock, weathered homes, and landscapes shaped by generations of families who have lived and worked on the land. The nearest major population centers feel far away. The pace of life moves differently. People wave to passing vehicles. Neighbors recognize each other's cars. Family names carry history. Stories travel quickly. In places like Mohacker, relationships are rarely simple. People grow up together. Attend the same schools. Share mutual relatives and friends. Celebrate milestones together. Mourn losses together. Even when disagreements arise, complete separation is often impossible. Lives remain interconnected. That interconnected nature creates a strong sense of belonging. But it can also magnify conflict. Because when tensions emerge, they do not remain confined to two individuals. They ripple outward. Friends become involved. Families hear different versions of events. Old grievances resurface. Rumors spread. Sides are quietly chosen. What begins as a disagreement between two people can slowly become something larger. Something heavier. Something far more difficult to escape. In 2019, life in and around Mohacker continued much as it had for years. Residents worked long hours. Families gathered for meals. People traveled between nearby communities for work, social events, and everyday errands. The routines were familiar, predictable, comforting. Yet beneath the surface of ordinary life, there were also struggles common to many rural communities. Economic pressures, personal disputes, generational tensions, the lingering effects of hardship. The realities of small-town life are often more complex than outsiders imagine. From a distance, such places can appear peaceful and uncomplicated. The reality is different. Human emotions remain the same no matter where people live. Jealousy exists. Resentment exists. Anger exists. Fear exists. The difference is that in a small community, those emotions often remain close. There is less room to disappear. Less anonymity. Less opportunity to walk away from a conflict and never encounter the other person again. The roads eventually bring people back together. The same gatherings are attended. The same faces appear. The same histories linger. In communities throughout rural New Zealand, family and identity carry enormous significance. Connections are deep. Many people maintain strong ties to their ancestors, their land, and their local communities. Those connections provide strength during difficult times. But they can also create powerful emotional stakes when disputes arise. An insult may feel larger. A perceived betrayal may cut deeper. A conflict may become intertwined with pride, reputation, and personal history. Long before the fatal events of June 18th, the people involved in this case already existed within that social environment. They were not strangers crossing paths for the first time. They moved within overlapping circles. Shared mutual connections. Recognized familiar faces. Understood the dynamics of the community around them. That fact would later become one of the most significant aspects of the case. Because the tragedy that unfolded did not arrive from outside. It emerged from within. The winter of 2019 had settled across the region. June in New Zealand brings shorter days and colder evenings. Darkness arrives early. Rural roads become quieter as night approaches. The countryside can feel almost empty after sunset. As daylight fades, distant farmhouses become isolated pockets of light scattered across enormous stretches of land. The darkness between them can seem endless. For residents, such conditions are normal. For investigators, they present challenges. Witnesses are fewer. Distances are greater. Movements are harder to track. Events can unfold unseen. On the surface, June 18th began as an ordinary day. People followed routines they had followed countless times before. No one could know that before the night was over, police vehicles would be heading toward Mohaka. No one could know that detectives would soon be searching for answers. No one could know that a homicide investigation would become the focus of an entire community. Yet if someone could have stepped back and viewed the situation from a distance, subtle warning signs might already have been visible. Small tensions. Small confrontations. Moments that seemed insignificant at the time. 2 days earlier, a dispute had already generated conflict within the area. Allegations involving stolen vehicle wheels had sparked anger. Accusations had been made. Violence had reportedly occurred. Property had been damaged. The incident may have appeared isolated. Another disagreement. Another argument. Another chapter in the endless series of conflicts that occur wherever human beings live. But sometimes those moments are not isolated at all. Sometimes they are pieces of a larger story that has not yet revealed itself. As June 18th approached, the atmosphere around certain individuals was becoming increasingly strained. Frustrations were growing. Emotions were escalating. And somewhere within that tension, decisions were being made. The kind of decisions that often remain invisible until it is too late. One of the unsettling realities of violent crime is that the final act usually receives the most attention. The shot. The assault. The fatal moment. But investigators know that major crimes often begin long before the violence itself. They begin in conversations. In grudges. In assumptions. In choices made days, weeks, or even months earlier. By the time the public learns of a tragedy, many critical events have already taken place. The Mohaka murder would prove no different. The shooting itself lasted only moments. The path leading toward it took far longer. As evening approached on June 18th, residents across the region settled into familiar routines. Some returned home from work. Others visited friends. Families prepared meals. Lights appeared in windows as darkness spread across the countryside. Nothing about the landscape suggested that history was about to change. The hills remained silent. The roads remained quiet. The winter air carried the same chill it had carried the night before. Yet somewhere within that darkness, events were already moving forward. A decision had been made. A journey was beginning. And the consequences would soon become irreversible. The remoteness that made Mohaca beautiful would also contribute to the haunting nature of the case. There is something unsettling about violence occurring in places associated with peace. A murder in a crowded city feels different. Cities already contain noise, urgency, and constant movement. But violence in a quiet rural community carries another emotional weight. It disrupts assumptions. It challenges beliefs about safety. It forces people to confront the reality that tragedy can occur anywhere. Even here. Especially here. In the months and years that followed, many people would remember exactly where they were when they first heard the news. Some learned through phone calls. Others through conversations with friends. Others through reports spreading rapidly across local networks. The details were incomplete at first. Only fragments emerged. A shooting. A young man critically injured. Police involvement. Questions without answers. As information slowly surfaced, shock spread through the community. Not because violence had never occurred before, but because every homicide carries a unique impact. It creates an absence. A permanent void. Someone who was present one day is suddenly gone the next. Families are left searching for meaning. Friends struggle to understand. Communities attempt to process the unthinkable. And investigators begin the difficult task of reconstructing the truth. That task would soon consume detectives assigned to the case. But before police could uncover what happened, before arrests were made, before courtroom proceedings began, there was a life at the center of the story. A real person. A son. A friend. A member of the community. A 29-year-old man whose future ended on a cold June night. To understand the full weight of this case, we must first understand the man whose life was taken. Because before Michael Huatar became the victim in a homicide investigation, he was simply Michael. And his story deserves to be told. One of the most difficult challenges in true crime storytelling is resisting the tendency to allow a victim's identity to become overshadowed by the crime itself. A homicide investigation generates headlines. Court proceedings generate records. Arrests generate public attention. The offender's actions are examined in detail. The evidence is analyzed. The legal arguments are debated. And slowly, almost unintentionally, the person whose life was taken risks becoming secondary to the story. That is why it is important to pause for a moment and remember a simple fact. Before there was a homicide investigation in Mohaca. Before detectives arrived. Before courtrooms and sentencing hearings. Before newspaper articles and legal documents. There was a man named Michael Huatar. He was 29 years old. And regardless of how much evidence would later be collected, regardless of how many legal proceedings would follow, that remains the central tragedy of this case. A 29-year-old life came to an abrupt and violent end. Publicly available information about Michael Huatar is limited. Unlike some high-profile cases that leave behind extensive interviews, biographies, and media coverage, much of Michael's private life remained outside public view. Perhaps that fact says something important in itself. Most victims are not public figures. Most do not leave behind lengthy records explaining who they were. Instead, they exist most vividly in the memories of the people who knew them. Family members. Friends. Neighbors. People who shared meals with them. People who laughed with them. People who expected to see them again. For those individuals, Michael was never simply a name in a police file. He was a real person occupying a real place within their lives. The tragedy of homicide extends far beyond the victim. When a life is taken, an entire network of relationships is damaged. Parents lose a child. Siblings lose a brother. Friends lose someone who was part of their daily routines. Communities lose a familiar face. The absence spreads outward like ripples across water. And those ripples never completely disappear. The available court record indicates that Michael and the eventual offender were not strangers. Their lives existed within overlapping social circles connected to the wider YROA and Mohaca communities. That detail would become significant later, not only because it helped investigators understand the circumstances surrounding the shooting, but because it added another layer of heartbreak. This was not a case involving two people whose paths happened to cross by chance. This was violence emerging from within a shared social environment. People knew one another, recognized one another, understood the local landscape and the relationships that existed within it. In many ways, that reality makes cases like this particularly painful for communities. Random violence is frightening, but familiar violence is deeply unsettling. It forces people to ask questions that have no easy answers. How did things reach this point? Could anyone have seen warning signs? Could the tragedy have been prevented? The fact that Michael's life ended in such circumstances would leave those questions lingering long after the criminal proceedings concluded. As June 2019 moved forward, there was no indication that Michael was approaching the final days of his life. That is another painful reality common to nearly every homicide case. Victims rarely know that an ordinary day will become their last. They make plans, hold conversations, visit friends, travel familiar roads, think about tomorrow. The future still exists in front of them. Then, suddenly, it does not. For Michael, June 18th began as a day that likely seemed no different from countless others that had come before it. The winter season had settled across the region. The countryside moved according to its usual rhythm. Life continued. People worked. People traveled. People gathered. No public record suggests that Michael expected the events that would unfold later that evening. Nothing indicates that he knew a deadly confrontation was approaching. Yet somewhere beyond his awareness, decisions were already being made that would ultimately intersect with his life. Those decisions would place him at the center of a tragedy he never chose. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of homicide investigations is the way they freeze a victim in time. Michael will forever be remembered as 29 years old. There will be no older version of him. No future milestones. No decades of experiences still waiting to unfold. The possibilities that once existed simply stop. Family members often describe this as one of the most painful dimensions of loss. They are not only grieving the person who died. They are grieving the future that disappeared with them. The birthdays that will never come. The conversations that will never happen. The memories that will never be created. Court proceedings can establish facts. Investigations can identify offenders. Sentences can impose punishment. But none of those outcomes restore what was lost. They cannot return a life. As investigators later reconstructed the events of June 18th, the final moments of Michael's life would become the subject of forensic analysis and legal examination. Distances would be measured. Movements would be scrutinized. Timelines would be assembled. Evidence would be presented. But beneath every technical detail remained a human reality. The victim was a living person only moments before the shooting occurred. A person with thoughts, relationships, experiences, and connections. A person whose life carried meaning far beyond the circumstances of his death. This distinction matters because true crime can sometimes become overly focused on mechanics. The weapon. The evidence. The procedure. The investigation. All of those elements are important. But they should never overshadow the human cost. Michael Huerta's death was not merely an event. It was a loss. A permanent loss felt by people who knew him and cared about him. As the evening of June 18th continued, Michael found himself at a property near Mohaca. The details of the coming encounter would later be examined extensively by police and the courts. At the time, however, it was simply another moment in the flow of ordinary life. The darkness of winter had begun settling across the countryside. Lights glowed from homes scattered throughout the region. The roads grew quieter. The night deepened. Somewhere nearby, a young man carrying a sawn-off shotgun waited in concealment. Michael did not know that. He could not know that. He could not know that investigators would soon be documenting a homicide scene. He could not know that police officers would spend months reconstructing the events of the night. He could not know that his name would eventually appear in court records connected to one of the most serious crimes in New Zealand law. What he knew was only the present moment. And within that moment, the future still seemed intact. That future would disappear in seconds. The story that follows is not simply the story of a murder investigation. It is the story of how one human life ended and how an entire community was forced to confront the consequences. Because before there was a victim in a criminal case, there was Michael Huata. And before the investigation could begin, tragedy had to unfold. By the evening of June 18, 2019, a chain of decisions had already been set in motion. Some of those decisions had been made days earlier. Others had been made only hours before. Taken individually, they might have appeared insignificant. Viewed together, they formed a path leading toward a single irreversible outcome. The winter night settled over Mohaka with the quiet familiarity that residents knew well. Darkness arrived early across the rural landscape. The roads grew emptier. The open farmland disappeared into shadow. Scattered homes became isolated islands of light surrounded by vast stretches of darkness. From a distance, nothing appeared unusual. The countryside looked exactly as it had the night before. And yet somewhere within that darkness, a young man was moving toward a property carrying a sawn-off shotgun. According to later court findings, Ben Wairama Arundel Lambert believed a person he was looking for might be at the property. That belief would become one of the central facts in understanding what happened next. Because Lambert did not arrive unexpectedly and immediately confront anyone. He arrived armed. He arrived intentionally. And after arriving, he waited. The significance of that waiting would later become impossible to ignore. The property sat within the quiet isolation typical of rural Hawke's Bay. Like many homes in the region, it existed within a landscape where neighbors were often separated by considerable distances. At night, visibility was limited. The darkness concealed movement and swallowed details. Lambert remained outside. He did not enter the house. Instead, he stayed concealed. Watching. Waiting. Observing. Time passed. Inside the property, life continued without any obvious indication that danger was present nearby. No one could see the future unfolding beyond the darkness. No one could know that a deadly encounter was only moments away. What makes cases like this especially disturbing is the contrast between ordinary life and sudden violence. For one moment, everything appears normal. The next moment changes everything. At some point during the evening, Michael Huata emerged from the house. Exactly what he expected to find outside is unknown. What is known is that he encountered Lambert. The confrontation that followed unfolded rapidly. Far more rapidly than the investigation that would later attempt to reconstruct it. Far more rapidly than the legal proceedings that would eventually examine every available detail. The encounter itself lasted only moments. There was no prolonged struggle. No lengthy sequence of events stretching over hours. Instead, the situation moved from confrontation to catastrophe with devastating speed. The darkness that had concealed Lambert now gave way to direct contact. The two men faced one another. What was said between them remains limited within the public record. What investigators were ultimately able to establish was far more important. A shotgun was present. And within seconds, it was fired. The blast shattered the quiet of the rural night. In isolated communities, sounds travel differently. A single gunshot can echo across open land. It can carry through fields and across valleys. It can transform an ordinary evening into an emergency. Michael Huata was struck in the face at close range. The injury was catastrophic. The violence of a shotgun discharge at such distance leaves little room for survival. The damage inflicted was immediate and severe. Everything changed in that instant. One moment Michael was alive and standing outside. The next moment he was critically wounded. For investigators who would later examine the evidence, the shooting demonstrated a level of violence impossible to ignore. This was not a minor injury. Not an accidental wound. Not a situation from which recovery was likely. The consequences of pulling the trigger were immediate and devastating. And yet, even as Michael's life hung in the balance, the events of the night were not over. Lambert left. According to evidence later presented in court, he departed the scene after the shooting. Rather than remaining there, rather than contacting emergency services, he moved away from the property. His actions following the shooting would become another significant component of the investigation. He drove away. At some point afterward, he abandoned the vehicle. Then he continued on foot. Across farmland. Across rural terrain. Moving through the darkness. The landscape that investigators would later search became part of his route away from the scene. Eventually, he disposed of the shotgun by throwing it into a stream. The weapon that had ended Michael Huerta's life disappeared beneath the water. Whether the intention was to eliminate evidence, create distance from the crime, or delay investigators, the result was the same. The weapon was removed from the immediate scene. Lambert then continued home. Meanwhile, an entirely different struggle was unfolding. Michael Huerta was still alive. Despite the severity of his injuries, efforts were made to save him. Emergency assistance became the priority. Every minute mattered. In serious trauma cases, time often becomes the most valuable resource available. The challenge was enormous. The shooting had occurred in a rural location. Medical care was not immediately next door. Distance became another obstacle. Michael was transported toward YROA Hospital, approximately 28 kilometers away. For the people attempting to help him, those kilometers must have felt endless. Hope and fear often coexist during medical emergencies. Until a doctor confirms otherwise, people cling to the possibility of survival. Families do it. Friends do it. Emergency responders do it. No matter how severe the injuries appear, hope remains. But some injuries are simply too severe. Despite efforts to save him, Michael Huerta died. He was 29 years old. The fatal shooting that had occurred only minutes earlier was now officially a homicide investigation. Somewhere along the route between the shooting and the hospital, the future that once belonged to Michael disappeared forever. The loss extended far beyond a single individual. News of violent crime travels quickly through small communities. People began hearing fragments of information. A shooting. A critical injury. Police involvement. Then confirmation of a death. Questions emerged almost immediately. Who had done it? Why had it happened? Was the shooter known? Had the attack been planned? In the hours following the shooting, uncertainty dominated everything. Investigators had not yet assembled the complete picture. Witness accounts still needed to be gathered. Evidence still needed to be collected. Timelines still needed to be established. But one fact was already undeniable. A young man was dead. The peaceful winter night that had begun like countless others in Mojaca had become the scene of a murder. And somewhere within the darkness surrounding that isolated property were the answers investigators would soon begin searching for. The gunshot itself had lasted only an instant. The consequences would last for years. For Michael's loved ones, the tragedy had only begun. For the community, shock was beginning to spread. And for detectives arriving to investigate the scene, a difficult task lay ahead. Somewhere among the evidence, the witness accounts, and the movements of the people involved, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. The hunt for that truth would begin before sunrise. And it would ultimately lead investigators toward a conclusion that would reshape the lives of everyone connected to the case. The first hours after a homicide are often the most chaotic. Information arrives in fragments. Witnesses struggle to process what they have seen. Rumors begin spreading before facts can be confirmed. Investigators are forced to make critical decisions while working with incomplete information. And somewhere within that confusion, the truth waits to be uncovered. For police responding to the events of June 18, 2019, the situation was no different. A young man had suffered a catastrophic gunshot wound. Despite efforts to save him, he had died. The case immediately moved beyond the scope of an ordinary incident. This was now a homicide investigation. The responsibility facing investigators was immense. Someone had pulled the trigger. Someone had arrived at a rural property carrying a firearm. Someone had left the scene afterward. The challenge was identifying exactly who that person was and proving what had happened. As the night progressed, the area connected to the shooting became the focus of intense police attention. In major investigations, the first objective is always preservation. Every minute that passes creates opportunities for evidence to disappear. Vehicles move. Footprints are disturbed. Memories begin changing. Weather alters the landscape. The scene must be protected before valuable information is lost. The property near Mohaca quickly transformed from an ordinary rural location into a crime scene. The transition is often startling. Places associated with everyday life suddenly become areas of forensic interest. Investigators examine details that most people would never notice. Ground surfaces. Entry points. Lines of sight. Distances. Lighting conditions. Possible witness locations. Potential escape routes. Everything becomes important. Everything becomes a question. The rural setting presented both advantages and challenges. On one hand, isolated locations can limit the number of people moving through an area after a crime occurs. On the other hand, the same isolation can make investigations more difficult. Fewer witnesses. Greater distances. Less surveillance. Fewer opportunities to reconstruct movements through cameras or electronic records. Detectives arriving at the scene understood that they would need to build the case carefully. Nothing could be assumed. Nothing could be overlooked. The physical evidence would become the foundation upon which the investigation rested. As daylight eventually returned to the countryside, the true scale of the investigative effort became visible. The quiet property was no longer simply a place where people gathered and lived. It had become the center of a murder inquiry. Police officers worked methodically through the area. Forensic specialists examined the location. Investigators documented what they found. Photographs were taken. Measurements were recorded. Observations were logged. Each detail added another piece to a puzzle that remained incomplete. One of the most difficult aspects of homicide investigations is that the most important evidence is not always obvious. Television dramas often portray cases being solved through dramatic discoveries. A single clue. A dramatic confession. A breakthrough appearing almost instantly. Reality is usually far less dramatic. Real investigations are built through patience. Small details. Careful analysis. The gradual accumulation of facts. The Mohaca investigation would follow that pattern. Detectives could not simply focus on the moment of the shooting itself. They needed to understand everything surrounding it. What happened before? What happened during? And what happened afterward? The timeline became a central priority. Investigators needed to know who was present, who arrived, who left, when those movements occurred, and how they connected to the fatal encounter. Witness interviews began forming an essential part of that process. Whenever a violent crime occurs within a community, detectives seek to establish a complete picture of the victim's final hours. Who saw them last? Who spoke with them? Who interacted with them? Were there signs of conflict? Were there unusual events leading up to the crime? Sometimes these interviews generate immediate answers. More often, they produce dozens of separate fragments that must later be assembled. A remembered conversation. A passing observation. A vehicle seen on a road. A person noticed in a particular location. Individually, such details may appear insignificant. Together, they can become powerful evidence. In the days following Michael Huerta's death, investigators worked to gather exactly that type of information. Every witness represented a possible source of insight. Every recollection carried potential value. Even details that seemed unimportant could eventually help establish the truth. At the same time, detectives examined the broader context surrounding the shooting. Homicide investigations rarely focus only on the final act of violence. They also examine the events leading toward it. Conflicts, disputes, previous incidents, relationships between those involved. Investigators attempt to understand whether warning signs existed before the crime occurred. As police dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding the case, attention began turning toward tensions that had emerged shortly before the shooting. Information surfaced regarding an earlier conflict in the community. Allegations involving stolen vehicle wheels had reportedly led to confrontation and violence only days before Michael's death. At first glance, such incidents might seem unrelated. But detectives are trained to look for connections. Violent crimes often leave trails behind them. Arguments escalate. Threats are exchanged. Resentments build. Understanding those dynamics can reveal motives and identify potential suspects. The significance of the earlier dispute would become increasingly important as investigators expanded their inquiry. Meanwhile, another challenge confronted detectives. The shooter had left the scene. This was not a case where police arrived and immediately found the offender waiting nearby. The person responsible had departed. Time therefore became critical. Every hour increased the possibility that evidence could be lost or concealed. Every day allowed opportunities for stories to change. The investigation needed momentum. Fortunately, homicide investigations possess resources not always available in less serious cases. Additional personnel can be assigned. Specialist teams can become involved. Regional resources can be mobilized. The death of Michael Huatar ensured that the case would receive significant attention from law enforcement. As the investigation progressed, police publicly confirmed that a homicide inquiry was underway. That announcement carried considerable weight. For residents of Mohaca and the wider YROA area, it transformed uncertainty into reality. This was no longer a suspected crime. It was officially a murder investigation. Public awareness increased. Conversations intensified. Speculation spread. People searched for explanations. Small communities often react strongly to such events because the impact feels personal. The crime does not occur somewhere distant. It happens close to home. Many residents either know the people involved directly or know someone who does. The emotional distance separating the community from the tragedy is small. That reality can generate both assistance and complications for investigators. On one hand, local knowledge often helps police. People share information. Witnesses come forward. Observations are reported. On the other hand, rumors can spread rapidly. Assumptions can become accepted as facts. Speculation can interfere with the search for truth. Detectives therefore faced a delicate balance. They needed cooperation from the community. At the same time, they needed evidence rather than rumor. Facts rather than assumptions. Proof rather than speculation. As forensic work continued, investigators slowly developed a clearer understanding of what had happened. The shooting itself was no longer the central mystery. Evidence strongly indicated that Michael had been deliberately shot at close range. The larger question was who had done it and how the events unfolded before and after the fatal moment. Every homicide investigation eventually reaches a stage where separate pieces begin connecting. Witness statements align with physical evidence. Timelines become clearer. Potential suspects emerge. Investigators move from asking broad questions toward testing specific theories. The Mohaca investigation was approaching that stage. The initial confusion that follows every major crime was beginning to give way to structure. Patterns were emerging. Connections were appearing. And detectives were increasingly focusing their attention on a particular direction. The answers they sought were no longer hidden somewhere within an endless range of possibilities. The field was narrowing. Evidence was guiding them forward. Somewhere beyond the crime scene, the person responsible was living with the knowledge of what had occurred. Investigators did not yet possess every answer. But they were getting closer. Closer to identifying the movements that occurred after the shooting. Closer to understanding the path taken away from the property. Closer to discovering what happened to the weapon. Closer to determining exactly who had waited in the darkness before Michael Huatar stepped outside. The homicide investigation that began with confusion and uncertainty was slowly becoming something else. A case. A theory. A developing narrative supported by evidence. And within that developing narrative, one name would soon attract increasing attention. A name detectives would find impossible to ignore. The search for answers was entering a new phase. The investigation was about to focus on a suspect. Every homicide investigation begins with uncertainty. No matter how experienced the detectives may be, the first days after a killing are often defined by unanswered questions. Investigators are confronted with fragments rather than conclusions. Pieces rather than a complete picture. The challenge is not simply finding evidence. The challenge is determining which evidence matters. In the days following Michael Huatar's death, detectives found themselves facing exactly that challenge. They knew a shooting had occurred. They knew the victim had suffered a devastating close-range gunshot wound. They knew the offender had left the scene. Beyond those facts, much remained unclear. The task ahead was enormous. Investigators needed to reconstruct the movements of multiple people. They needed to establish timelines. They needed to understand relationships. Most importantly, they needed to identify the individual responsible for pulling the trigger. The pressure was significant. A homicide investigation affects an entire community. Family members want answers. Friends want answers. The public wants answers. Every day without an arrest creates anxiety and uncertainty. Yet experienced detectives understand that rushing can be dangerous. An arrest unsupported by evidence helps no one. The goal is not merely to identify a suspect. The goal is to build a case capable of surviving scrutiny in court. That process takes time. As investigators continued examining the circumstances surrounding the shooting, they focused heavily on the relationships connecting the people involved. One of the first realities to emerge was that this was not a random act committed by a stranger passing through the area. The victim and the eventual offender existed within overlapping social circles. That fact immediately narrowed the scope of the investigation. When a homicide occurs between people who know one another, detectives often begin by examining recent conflicts, disputes, and interactions. Who had argued with whom? Who held grudges? Who had recently been involved in confrontations? Who had reason to seek revenge or retaliation? These questions became increasingly important. Attention gradually turned toward incidents that had occurred shortly before the shooting. Information gathered by investigators indicated that tensions had been present in the days leading up to Michael's death. A dispute involving allegedly stolen vehicle wheels had generated conflict within the community. The incident had reportedly escalated beyond words. Violence had occurred. Property damage had been reported. Strong emotions were already circulating among individuals connected to the dispute. From an investigative perspective, this was significant. Detectives know that serious violence rarely appears from nowhere. There are often warning signs. Arguments. Threats. Confrontations. Escalations. Each event creates context. And context helps explain motive. As officers interviewed witnesses, patterns began emerging. Individual statements that initially seemed isolated started reinforcing one another. People described events leading up to the shooting. They described conflicts. They described interactions. They described individuals whose names repeatedly surfaced during the inquiry. The investigation was beginning to take shape. At the same time, detectives continued examining what happened after the shooting itself. This phase of the investigation often proves critical. People can lie about intentions. They can deny involvement. They can alter their stories. Physical movements, however, are much harder to conceal completely. Vehicles travel specific routes. People appear in certain locations. Objects are moved. Evidence is discarded. Each action leaves traces. Investigators therefore focused intensely on reconstructing the shooter's movements following the fatal encounter. The evidence would later establish that the gunman had not remained at the scene. Instead, he had left. He had driven away. He had eventually abandoned a vehicle. He had continued on foot across farmland. And he had disposed of the shotgun by throwing it into a stream. At the time investigators were piecing together these events, however, they did not possess every detail. They had to discover them. Step by step. Fact by fact. This is where homicide investigations often become exercises in patience. Detectives spend countless hours following leads that ultimately go nowhere. Potential witnesses remember little. Rumors prove false. Assumptions collapse under scrutiny. The public rarely sees this part of an investigation. The long days. The repeated interviews. The endless review of statements. The effort required to separate truth from speculation. Yet this work is essential. Because major cases are often solved through persistence rather than dramatic breakthroughs. The Mohacker investigation was no exception. As information accumulated, investigators increasingly focused on one individual. Ben Wairama Arundel Lambert. The reasons for that focus were not based on a single piece of evidence. Rather, they emerged from the growing body of information detectives had assembled. Witness accounts. Prior conflicts. Movements before and after the shooting. The broader context surrounding the case. Together, these factors pointed investigators toward Lambert. Once a person becomes a primary suspect, investigators begin testing every aspect of that theory. Does the evidence support involvement? Do witness statements align? Are there contradictions? Can movements be verified? Can timelines be established? The objective is not to confirm an assumption. The objective is to challenge it. A strong investigation attempts to disprove its own theories. If the theory survives scrutiny, confidence grows. If it collapses, detectives move in another direction. By late June, confidence was increasing. The investigation was narrowing. The field of possibilities was shrinking. And detectives were approaching a critical moment. Meanwhile, the community continued living beneath the shadow of the unsolved homicide. In small communities, uncertainty can feel particularly oppressive. People talk, speculate, question. Every new rumor generates additional tension. The knowledge that a killer remains free creates unease. Residents wonder whether an arrest is imminent. Whether police know more than they have revealed. Whether justice is approaching or slipping away. For Michael Huerta's family, those days must have been especially painful. Grief is difficult enough on its own. Grief combined with uncertainty can be unbearable. They knew Michael was gone. They knew his death had been violent. What they did not yet have was accountability. Investigators understood that responsibility. Every homicide detective knows that behind the evidence lies a family waiting for answers. That reality drives the work. As the days passed, detectives continued building their case. The investigation was no longer searching blindly. It was moving with direction. The evidence pointed toward a specific individual. Now investigators needed action. That action arrived on June 27, 2019. 9 days after the fatal shooting. Police arrested Ben Lambert in Napier. The arrest marked a major turning point in the case. For investigators, it represented the culmination of days of intensive work. For the community, it provided the first indication that the homicide inquiry was producing results. For Michael's family, it was the beginning of a new chapter in the search for justice. But an arrest is not the same as a conviction. detectives still faced significant challenges. Evidence would need to be presented. The prosecution would need to establish guilt. The legal process would need to run its course. And homicide cases are rarely straightforward. Suspects deny involvement. Witnesses change accounts. Legal arguments emerge. Trials become battlegrounds over facts and interpretations. At the moment of arrest, none of those future developments were certain. What investigators did know was that they had identified the man they believed was responsible. Lambert was charged with murder, one of the most serious accusations available under New Zealand law. The charge reflected the gravity of the evidence and the seriousness of the crime. Still, questions remained. Would the case proceed to a full jury trial? Would the evidence withstand scrutiny? Would the prosecution succeed? Those answers lay in the future. Yet the investigation was not completely finished. Even after an arrest, detectives continue gathering information. Evidence must be strengthened. Statements must be verified. Loose ends must be tied together. Investigators worked to ensure that every element of the case was supported. Every timeline. Every movement. Every connection. Because eventually the case would leave the hands of detectives and enter a courtroom. And in that courtroom, every detail would matter. The homicide investigation that began with confusion and uncertainty had now identified a suspect. But the story was far from over. The most important development had yet to come. Because as investigators continued their work, something unexpected would happen. The man accused of murder would eventually make admissions that changed the entire course of the case. Admissions that removed many of the remaining doubts. Admissions that brought investigators closer than ever to the truth of what happened on that cold winter night in Mohaca. The breakthrough was approaching. And with it would come a clearer understanding of how a local dispute, a firearm, and a series of decisions ended in irreversible tragedy. In homicide investigations, there is a moment that detectives often recognize only in hindsight. It is not always loud. It is not always dramatic. It does not always arrive with immediate clarity. Sometimes it begins quietly, buried inside an interview room, a written statement, or a conversation that seems routine at first glance. And then, slowly, it changes everything. For the Mohaca investigation, that turning point emerged not from forensic evidence alone, and not from a single eyewitness account, but from something far more decisive. A shift in what the accused himself was willing to say. By the time Ben Lambert had been taken into custody in Napier on June 27, 2019, investigators already had enough information to charge him with murder. The case was built on witness accounts, physical evidence, and reconstructed movements across the rural landscape. But like many homicide cases at that stage, there were still gaps. Pieces of the timeline that required confirmation. Details that needed clarification. Questions that had not yet been fully answered in a way that would eliminate reasonable doubt. Detectives knew that arrests can sometimes produce silence, denial, legal resistance, a complete refusal to engage. But they also knew something else. In certain cases, once a suspect is confronted with the total weight of evidence, that silence can begin to break. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, through pressure, contradiction, and the accumulation of detail. According to later court references and investigative records, Lambert eventually made admissions during police questioning that he was the person who fired the fatal shot. That statement became one of the most significant developments in the entire case. Because up until that point, the investigation had been building a theory supported by evidence. After that point, investigators were no longer working solely with inference. They were working with confirmation from the person at the center of the incident. The importance of such admissions in homicide investigations cannot be overstated. Physical evidence can suggest. Witnesses can describe. Forensic analysis can reconstruct. But an admission from the accused transforms the structure of a case. It connects intent, action, and outcome in a way that is difficult to ignore in court proceedings. For detectives, It represented validation of the direction the investigation had taken. The theory they had been building was not only consistent with evidence, it was consistent with the account of the person responsible. However, even with that breakthrough, the investigation did not end. In fact, in many ways, it became even more focused. Because now the objective was not only to establish what had happened, but to ensure that every element could withstand legal scrutiny. Admissions must be tested. Statements must be verified against physical evidence. Timelines must align precisely with known movements. Courts require more than confession alone. They require corroboration. The investigation therefore continued to expand outward from that central admission, returning again to the physical environment where the shooting had taken place. The rural property near Mohaca remained a key focus. Every detail mattered. The position where the confrontation occurred. The line of sight between individuals. The distance between shooter and victim. The surrounding terrain. The lighting conditions of a winter evening. Each factor contributed to understanding the sequence of events in those final moments. Detectives also revisited the actions that followed the shooting. Lambert's departure from the scene. The abandonment of the vehicle. The movement across farmland. The disposal of the firearm into a stream. Each step was examined not only as a fact, but as part of a pattern. A sequence of behavior that provided insight into state of mind and awareness of consequences. In homicide investigations, post-offense conduct is often as significant as the act itself. It can indicate panic. It can indicate calculation. It can indicate attempts to avoid detection. Or it can reveal a combination of all three. In this case, the movement away from the scene and disposal of the weapon became important pieces in reconstructing the full narrative. Meanwhile, investigators were also working to strengthen the broader evidential framework. Witness statements collected in the days following the shooting were reviewed again. Initial impressions were compared against physical findings. Small inconsistencies were clarified. New information was integrated into the timeline. The goal was not simply to build a narrative that made sense. The goal was to build a narrative that could be proven. As the investigation progressed, the case began transitioning from active inquiry to structured prosecution preparation. This is a critical phase in any serious criminal investigation. Detectives and prosecutors work closely to ensure that evidence is organized in a way that aligns with legal standards. Every claim must be supported. Every assertion must be backed by documentation, testimony, or forensic confirmation. Nothing can be assumed. Nothing can be left ambiguous. At the same time, the emotional weight of the case continued to be felt across the community. For those living in and around Mohaca and YROA, the arrest of Lambert provided partial relief, but not closure. An arrest does not resolve grief. It does not restore what was lost. It does not answer every lingering question in the hearts of those affected. For Michael Huerta's family, the period following the arrest marked the beginning of a long legal process. A process that would require patience. A process that would require revisiting painful details. A process that would ultimately take months to reach its conclusion. In many homicide cases, families describe this stage as a form of suspended time. The initial shock of the loss has already occurred. The reality of the death is known. But justice has not yet been fully delivered. There is movement, but not resolution. Progress, but not closure. As 2019 progressed into 2020, the case moved deeper into the court system. Lambert faced formal charges of murder. The legal process began shaping the structure of what would eventually be presented before a judge or jury. In the background, prosecutors evaluated the strength of the evidence. Defense counsel prepared responses. Witness availability was assessed. Procedural steps were completed. Every aspect of the case was being prepared for the possibility of a full trial. But the trajectory of the case would eventually take an unexpected turn. In many homicide prosecutions, the final resolution comes through contested trial. Evidence is presented. Arguments are made. A verdict is reached after deliberation. However, not all cases follow that path. Some reach a point where the accused chooses to change their legal position. That moment arrived in October 2020. By that time, the case against Lambert had been prepared for a jury trial in the High Court at Gisborne. The courtroom was ready. The prosecution was prepared to present its evidence. The defense was positioned to respond. But instead of proceeding through a full trial, Lambert entered a guilty plea to the charge of murder. The decision changed the direction of the entire case. For the court system, it meant that the central question of guilt no longer needed to be determined by a jury. For the prosecution, it confirmed the strength of the case that had been built. For the victim's family, it eliminated the uncertainty of a contested trial, but it did not eliminate the emotional impact of the proceedings. Courtrooms are often described as places of justice. But they are also places of memory. On the day of the guilty plea, the reality of what had occurred in June 2019 was formally acknowledged in a legal sense. The man accused of killing Michael Huatar accepted responsibility within the structure of the court. Following the plea, the case moved toward sentencing. This stage focuses not on whether a crime occurred, but on how it should be legally addressed. Factors such as the seriousness of the offense, the circumstances surrounding it, and the impact on the victim's family are all considered. In November 2020, Lambert was sentenced in the High Court. The court imposed a sentence of life imprisonment, with a minimum period of imprisonment set before eligibility for parole. The sentence reflected the gravity of the offense as established through evidence and admitted facts. A life was taken. A firearm was used. The act was deliberate in its execution as established by the circumstances described in court. For the legal system, the sentencing marked the formal conclusion of the case. But for everyone else connected to the events, it represented something more complex. An endpoint in procedure. But not necessarily an endpoint in grief. The breakthrough in this case did not come from a single dramatic revelation. It came from the accumulation of evidence. From investigative persistence. From witness cooperation. From forensic reconstruction. And finally, from the decision of the accused to acknowledge his role in the killing. Together, these elements transformed uncertainty into clarity. But even clarity cannot reverse what happened on that winter night in Mohaca. It can only define it. And define it, the courts eventually did. With that definition in place, the final phase of the story moves beyond investigation and into judgment, consequence, and reflection. Because once the facts are established, what remains is understanding what those facts mean. For a community. For a family. And for a life that ended far too soon. Courtrooms are often described as places where truth is revealed, but in reality they are places where truth is constructed, tested, and formally recognized within the boundaries of law. By the time the case of Michael Huatar reached the High Court in Gisborne, the most important facts were no longer in dispute in the way they had been during the early stages of the investigation. The arrest had already been made. The admissions made during police questioning had already shaped the direction of the case. And then came the moment that removed the final layer of uncertainty. A guilty plea to murder. In that instant, the adversarial structure of a trial collapsed into acknowledgement. The prosecution no longer needed to prove responsibility to a jury, because the accused himself accepted legal responsibility for the killing. But while the legal question of guilt was resolved, the deeper questions surrounding the case remained present in the courtroom atmosphere. What happened on that night in Mohaca? How it unfolded? And what it meant for those left behind? On the day of sentencing, the courtroom carried a weight that extended beyond formal procedure. Family members of Michael Huatar were present, occupying a space that no family ever wants to enter. Courtrooms become places where grief is made public. Where private loss is translated into legal language. Where emotional pain must exist alongside procedural order. The facts of the case, already established through investigation and admission, were presented in a structured form for sentencing purposes. The court considered the sequence of events that led to Michael Huatar's death, the circumstances surrounding the confrontation, and the actions taken before and after the shooting. The judge also had to consider the nature of the offending itself. This was not a spontaneous altercation that escalated unexpectedly. The court examined evidence indicating that the offender arrived at the rural property armed with a sawn-off shotgun, waited outside, observed the environment, and engaged in a brief confrontation that ended with a fatal discharge at close range. The subsequent departure from the scene, abandonment of the vehicle, movement across rural terrain, and disposal of the weapon were all considered as part of the overall criminal conduct. In sentencing, courts do not only look at the final act. They assess the full context, including planning, intent, and behavior after the offense. These factors influence the seriousness attributed to the crime and the resulting punishment. The judge ultimately imposed a sentence of life imprisonment, with a minimum period of imprisonment required to be served before parole eligibility. This is the standard maximum penalty available under New Zealand law for murder, reflecting society's recognition of the gravity of taking a human life. But beyond the legal structure of sentencing, the courtroom also became a place where the impact of the crime was made visible through the presence and responses of those affected. For Michael Huata's family, the proceedings were not simply about legal resolution. They were about confronting the reality of loss in a formal setting where every detail of the final moments of his life was discussed openly. That experience is often described in such cases as both necessary and deeply painful. Necessary because justice requires transparency. Painful because it forces families to relive events they would never choose to revisit. Statements and emotional responses from family members, as is common in homicide sentencing hearings, reflected the enduring impact of the loss. The absence of Michael Huata was not abstract. It was personal, immediate, and permanent. The courtroom became a space where that absence was acknowledged not only in legal terms but in human terms. Across the courtroom, another reality was also present. The offender, now facing the consequences of his actions in a formal judicial setting, stood within a system designed to measure responsibility and impose accountability. Sentencing hearings in murder cases are not only about punishment. They are also about defining the boundaries of societal response to extreme harm. Life imprisonment serves as that boundary. It communicates that certain actions place an individual outside the normal framework of reintegration for an extended period of time. It reflects the severity with which the justice system treats intentional or reckless acts that result in the taking of life. Yet even with this structure in place, sentencing does not resolve the emotional dimension of a case like this. For the community of Mohaka and the wider Wairoa region, the conclusion of legal proceedings marked the end of one chapter but not the end of its effects. Small communities carry memory differently. Events are not easily separated from place. Roads, properties, and familiar landscapes remain, but their meaning is altered by what has occurred there. A rural road is no longer just a road when it becomes associated with a homicide investigation. A property is no longer just a property when it becomes the center of a fatal encounter. The physical environment remains unchanged, but its emotional significance is permanently transformed. In the months following sentencing, attention gradually shifted away from court proceedings and back toward everyday life. But for those directly affected, there is no complete return to what existed before. Grief does not follow legal timelines. Closure is not delivered in a single moment. It develops slowly, unevenly, and often incompletely. One of the most difficult aspects of cases like this is the permanence of their consequences. The legal system can impose punishment. It can establish accountability. It can formally recognize wrongdoing. But it cannot restore what was lost. Michael Huata's life ended in a brief but irreversible moment of violence. The legal process that followed could only address responsibility, not reversal. For investigators, the conclusion of the case represented the completion of their work. The evidence had been gathered, analyzed, and presented. The sequence of events had been reconstructed. The offender had been identified, charged, and ultimately sentenced. From a professional standpoint, the case reached resolution. But homicide investigations often leave behind a quieter understanding among those who work them. That resolution in legal terms does not equate to resolution in human terms. Detectives close files. Courts issue sentences. But the impact of the case continues in the lives of those connected to it. For Michael Huerta's family, every future milestone exists in contrast with absence. Birthdays, anniversaries, and ordinary days all carry the memory of what was lost. The passage of time does not erase that absence, it simply places it further into the past while keeping its emotional presence intact. For the offender, life imprisonment introduces a different kind of permanence. The consequences of the actions taken on that winter night define the structure of the years that follow. The legal system has determined accountability, and the sentence reflects society's judgment on the seriousness of the act. For the community, the case becomes part of local history. A reference point. A reminder. A story that will be retold not only for its facts but for its impact. Justice in this case is therefore not a single moment, but a layered outcome. It exists in the conviction. It exists in the sentencing. It exists in the acknowledgement of responsibility within the courtroom. But it also exists alongside ongoing grief, unanswered emotional questions, and the lasting absence of a young man whose life was taken far too soon. As the courtroom emptied and the formal proceedings concluded, what remained was the reality that justice in legal terms had been delivered, but the human cost remained unchanged. And in that space between law and loss, the final understanding of the case begins to take shape. Not as an ending, but as a recognition of everything that cannot be undone. When a criminal case ends in court, it creates the impression of closure. Files are archived, sentences are recorded, and official processes move forward as if the story has reached its final page. But for the people left behind, there is no such clear ending. Life continues, yet it continues in a world permanently altered by what has already happened. In Mojaca and the wider YROA region, the events surrounding the death of Michael Huerta did not disappear once the courtroom doors closed. They settled instead into memory, becoming part of the landscape in a way that is invisible but deeply felt. Roads remain the same, fields remain the same, houses remain standing in their places, but for those who lived through the events of June 2019, those places carry an additional weight that cannot be removed. For Michael Huerta's family, the aftermath is not a chapter that concludes. It is a condition that continues. Grief does not move in a straight line. It returns unexpectedly, sometimes triggered by dates, sometimes by places, sometimes by ordinary moments that have no obvious connection to the past. A conversation, a photograph, a familiar road, or even silence can bring back the reality of loss with the same force it carried in the beginning. There is also the reality of absence in its most ordinary form. The absence of someone in daily routines. The absence of future conversations that will never happen. The absence of shared experiences that were once expected but will never come. These are not dramatic moments. They are quiet, persistent gaps that remain present in everyday life. In cases like this, justice is often spoken of as the final outcome of the legal system. A guilty plea, a conviction, and a sentence of life imprisonment provide a formal resolution to the question of responsibility. The system has done its work in establishing what happened and assigning consequences. But justice in the courtroom does not translate directly into emotional resolution outside of it. For the community, the case becomes part of collective memory. People remember where they were when they first heard the news. They remember the uncertainty of the early days of the investigation, the speculation that followed, and the eventual confirmation of what had occurred. Over time, those memories settle into a quieter form, but they do not disappear completely. They become part of how the place is remembered, especially by those who lived through it. Small communities are shaped strongly by shared events. A single tragedy can influence how people perceive safety, trust, and familiarity within their environment. Even after the legal process concludes, there is often a lingering awareness that violence can emerge in places where it is least expected. That awareness does not dominate daily life, but it remains beneath the surface. For investigators and legal professionals involved in the case, the aftermath is different again. Their role concludes when the file is closed and the court process is completed, but the experience remains part of their professional memory. Homicide investigations are not routine work. Each one carries its own emotional and psychological imprint. Even when justice is achieved, the details of the case do not disappear easily. The final sentencing in November 2020 marked the end of formal proceedings, but it did not mark the end of reflection. Cases like this often lead to broader questions about violence, conflict, and the conditions that allow a dispute to escalate into irreversible harm. In this case, what began as tension within a small social environment ultimately resulted in the loss of a life, a criminal conviction, and long-term consequences for everyone involved. One of the most difficult truths in any homicide case is the permanence of its outcome. The legal system can respond, but it cannot reverse. No sentence can restore what was lost. No verdict can return a person to the world they left. The gap created by death remains fixed in time. For Michael Huerta's family, his life is remembered not through the lens of the case, but through personal memory. The version of him that exists in those memories is not defined by the final moments of his life. It is defined by everything that came before. That distinction is important, because criminal cases often focus on the circumstances of death, while families hold on to the broader reality of life. Over time, the intensity of public attention fades. Media coverage diminishes, court references become less frequent, and the case gradually shifts from current events into history. But for those directly affected, time does not erase the impact. It only changes its form. The offender in this case will spend years within the prison system, serving a life sentence with a minimum non-parole period. That reality represents the legal consequence of the actions taken on that winter night in Mojaca. It is the system's way of expressing society's judgment on the severity of taking a human life. But even within that structure, the broader human questions remain untouched. Understanding how and why events unfolded does not undo them. In reflecting on this case, what stands out is not only the sequence of events, but the fragility of the line that separates conflict from catastrophe. A dispute, an encounter, a moment of confrontation, and a single irreversible action were enough to change multiple lives permanently. That progression is not unique to this case, but it is starkly visible within it. True crime stories often search for meaning in endings, but sometimes the only meaning that can be found is in the recognition of what has been lost. A life ended. A family changed. A community affected. A legal system that responded as it is designed to, but a reality that remains unchanged by its response. As time continues to pass, the case of Michael Huerta and the Mojaca shooting will remain recorded in legal archives and memory. It will be referenced in court documents, in investigative histories, and in the recollections of those who were involved. But beyond those records, it also remains a reminder of something more fundamental. That every act of violence begins as a series of choices. And every one of those choices carries consequences that extend far beyond the moment they are made. In the end, there is no final resolution that can fully contain a story like this. There is only acknowledgement. Acknowledgement of what happened. Acknowledgement of its impact. And acknowledgement that some losses remain permanent, even when the law has spoken and the case is officially closed. The story does not end with justice. It ends with remembrance. Every case that begins with violence ends twice. The first ending happens in court, when the law reaches its conclusion and a sentence is delivered. The second ending happens quietly, long after the headlines fade, when the people involved are left alone with what remains of the experience. In the case of Michael Huerta and the Mojaca shooting, those two endings sit far apart from each other, separated by time, emotion, and the limits of what justice can actually achieve. The court has already spoken. The facts have been established through investigation, admissions, and legal process. A life was taken in a rural part of Hawke's Bay during a winter evening in June 2019. The offender was identified, arrested, and ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment. From the perspective of the justice system, the case reached its conclusion. The structure of law was satisfied. Responsibility was assigned. Consequences were imposed. But the human reality of the case does not close in the same way. For Michael Huerta's family, The passage of time does not transform the outcome. It only changes how the absence is carried. At first, grief is immediate and overwhelming, defined by shock and disbelief. Later, it becomes quieter but no less present, embedded in daily life rather than standing apart from it. Years can pass, and yet certain moments will always return to the same point in time where everything changed. There is no version of events in which Michael simply grows older, moves forward, and continues his life. That possibility ended on the night of the shooting. Everything that might have followed remains permanently unrealized. That is the aspect of homicide that legal language can describe but never fully contain. A sentence can define accountability, but it cannot recreate possibility. For those who lived in and around Mohaca, the case becomes part of local memory in a different way. It is not always spoken about directly, but it exists beneath conversations, beneath familiarity with place, beneath the understanding that even quiet rural environments are not entirely insulated from violence. Over time, the intensity of the moment fades, but the awareness remains. Certain events leave behind a trace that does not fully disappear. The offender's life continues within the structure of the prison system, shaped by the consequences of a single night of decisions. The legal outcome reflects the seriousness of taking a human life, and the sentence ensures that responsibility is not avoided. Yet even within that framework, the broader questions remain unanswered. No judicial outcome can fully explain how a chain of events reaches the point where a confrontation becomes irreversible. In reflecting on this case, it becomes clear that its significance is not limited to what happened in court or on the night of the shooting. It is also found in the fragile sequence of events that led there. A dispute within a small community, rising tensions, prior conflict, a decision to carry a firearm, a moment of confrontation in darkness, a single act that could not be undone. Each step on its own might seem small or ordinary in isolation, but together they formed a path toward tragedy. This is often how violent cases unfold. Not through a single dramatic rupture, but through accumulation. Choices layered on top of other choices. Emotions left unresolved. Situations allowed to escalate. Until eventually, there is no longer space for reversal. The purpose of revisiting such a case is not to sensationalize what happened, nor to reduce it to a simplified narrative of good and evil. It is to understand how quickly ordinary conditions can shift into irreversible outcomes, and how the consequences of those shifts extend far beyond the individuals directly involved. For investigators, prosecutors, and legal professionals, the case represents a completed file, a process that moved from inquiry to resolution. For the community, it remains part of lived experience, a reminder that events of this nature can occur even in places where people feel most familiar and secure. For the family of the victim, it remains something far more personal, a permanent absence that time does not resolve. In the end, the story of the Mohaca shooting is not defined solely by the moment of violence or the legal outcome that followed. It is defined by everything that was lost in an instant and everything that continues afterward in silence. There is no final explanation that can fully encompass it. There is only the record of what happened, the recognition of its impact, and the understanding that some consequences extend beyond the reach of any courtroom. The case is closed in law. But in memory, it continues. When a case is examined after its conclusion, time creates a certain distance between the events and the telling of them. That distance can make details clearer, but it can also make the emotional weight more difficult to fully capture. The Mohaca shooting, the death of Michael Huerta, and the conviction of Ben Lambert exist now as part of that completed history, yet the meaning of what happened continues to extend beyond the boundaries of dates, courtrooms, and official records. At its core, this case is not defined by complexity in the way some investigations are. There is no long-hidden conspiracy, no elaborate scheme that unfolded over years, no intricate web of deception requiring extraordinary reconstruction. Instead, what stands out is how ordinary circumstances, when combined with escalating conflict and a fatal decision, can produce irreversible consequences in a very short span of time. A rural setting. A small community. Individuals who knew one another within overlapping social circles. A dispute that contributed to tension. A decision to carry a firearm. A confrontation that occurred in darkness. A single shot. A life ending in moments. These elements, when placed together, form a sequence that is simple to describe but difficult to fully comprehend in emotional terms. One of the most striking aspects of cases like this is how quickly the boundary between ordinary life and tragedy can be crossed. On one side of that boundary are routine days, familiar faces, and expectations for the future. On the other side is a permanent absence that reshapes everything that follows. The transition between those two states can occur without warning, and once it happens, there is no return to the previous version of reality. For those who investigate such cases, there is a professional necessity in focusing on facts, timelines, and evidence. That structure allows events to be understood, reconstructed, and ultimately presented within the legal system. But even within that structure, there is an awareness that not everything can be fully contained by documentation. Human consequences extend beyond what can be recorded in statements or summarized in judgments. For the family of Michael Huatar, the case is not a sequence of investigative steps or legal outcomes. It is a moment in time that divides life into before and after. Everything before that moment belongs to memory. Everything after is shaped by its absence. This kind of loss does not resolve through explanation. It does not diminish through procedural completion. It remains present in a way that is not dependent on attention or visibility. For the wider community, the event becomes part of collective memory. Over time, conversations about it may become less frequent, and the immediate shock may fade, but the awareness of what occurred does not disappear entirely. Places retain memory in subtle ways. A road, a property, a stretch of countryside can all carry associations that persist long after public focus has moved elsewhere. The environment remains physically unchanged, but its meaning is altered. For the justice system, the case reaches its endpoint in sentencing. Life imprisonment reflects the seriousness with which the law treats the taking of a human life. It establishes accountability within a defined legal framework. It closes the formal process of determining guilt and assigning consequence. Yet even this structured conclusion exists alongside a reality that cannot be resolved through legal means alone. The law can respond to actions, but it cannot restore what those actions have taken away. There is also a broader lesson that cases like this inevitably raise, even if they do not explicitly intend to. It is the recognition that escalation often happens in stages that appear manageable at the time. Conflicts that seem containable can intensify. Emotions that are not addressed can accumulate. Decisions made in moments of anger or certainty can have outcomes that extend far beyond their immediate context. The path from disagreement to irreversible harm is rarely sudden in its formation, even if it is sudden in its conclusion. Yet reflection must also be careful not to reduce a human life to the circumstances of its end. Michael Huatar's existence was not defined by the moment he died. That moment is what the public case focuses on, because that is what the law must address, but it is not the sum of who he was. Every person is larger than the event that ends their life. They are shaped by relationships, experiences, and everyday moments that are not recorded in official documents. In the same way, understanding a case does not require simplifying the people involved into fixed roles. Legal systems assign categories such as victim and offender because they are necessary for structure and judgment. But human reality exists in a broader space where complexity, history, and context all intersect. A true understanding of such cases requires acknowledging that distinction without losing sight of responsibility. As time continues to pass, the Mohaca shooting will remain part of legal archives and public record. It will be referenced in the context of criminal proceedings, investigative work, and judicial outcomes. But beyond those formal references, it will also remain part of personal memory for those directly affected, and part of local history for those who lived through its unfolding. The final reflection that remains is not a conclusion in the traditional sense. It is an acknowledgement of permanence. The permanence of loss. The permanence of consequences. The permanence of decisions made in a moment that cannot be undone. The legal system has completed its role. The investigation has concluded. The courts have delivered their judgment. But what remains is something that exists outside of those structures. A reminder that every act of violence begins in the world of choices and ends in a reality that cannot be reversed.